Deep in the Brazilian Amazon, there is a town where American fire hydrants rust beside mango trees, where a water tower stamped with Ford's name rises above forest canopy, where the grid of a Midwestern factory town was carved into jungle and then swallowed back. Fordlândia, the name itself a hybrid, industrial ambition grafted onto Portuguese soil. Henry Ford built it in 1927 to secure rubber for his automobile empire. He envisioned assembly line efficiency transplanted to the equator. What he created was a monument to the belief that nature, like labor, could be standardized. If stories like this stay with you, the collision between industrial conviction and ecological reality, between American certainty and Amazonian complexity, consider subscribing. We're working toward our first 1,000, and your support allows us to investigate the dreams that were built in concrete and vines. The project consumed 10,000 hectares of rainforest. Ford's engineers arrived with blueprints for workers' housing, a hospital, a school, a golf course, a cinema. They brought prefabricated homes designed for Michigan winters. They installed sidewalks where no one walked. They planted rubber trees in neat rows, as if the Amazon were Iowa. Ford himself never visited. He did not need to. He had never doubted that American methods would succeed anywhere they were applied with sufficient capital and discipline. At its peak, Fordlândia was designed to house 10,000 workers and produce enough latex to make the Ford Motor Company independent of British rubber cartels. The investment exceeded $20 million across 2 decades, a fortune measured not just in currency, but in cleared forest, in displaced communities, in the confidence that progress was a straight line running from Detroit to the equator. Ford purchased the land for practically nothing. The Brazilian government, eager for development, asked few questions. The Americans arrived with engineers, accountants, and an unshakable faith in industrial logic. But the Amazon operates by different rules. The soil Ford's planners assumed was fertile turned out to be thin, depleted within years. The rubber trees, planted in densely ordered groves, became breeding grounds for pests and disease, a catastrophe that would never have occurred in the wild, scattered growth of native rubber. The workers, many of them indigenous and caboclo populations, were expected to live by Ford's moral code. No alcohol, no tobacco, American meals served at American hours. They were paid in scrip, not currency. They were forbidden to hunt or fish on company land. Resentment simmered, then erupted. The question that haunts every image of Fordlândia today is simple, and it echoes in the empty manager's mansion, in the abandoned powerhouse, in the rubber trees that never produced enough latex to justify a single tire. Can an industrial dream survive when it ignores the land and the people living on it? To understand what failed here, one must first understand what Ford believed was possible. Henry Ford did not believe in problems that could not be solved by American ingenuity and vertical integration. By the mid-1920s, his automobile empire consumed an immense quantity of rubber, tires, hoses, gaskets, belts. Nearly all of it came from plantations in British-controlled Malaya and Dutch-controlled Sumatra. The British, recognizing their leverage, imposed export restrictions and inflated prices. Ford, who had spent his career eliminating dependencies, would not tolerate this one. If he could not buy rubber on his terms, he would grow it himself. The Amazon was the obvious choice. Rubber was native there. Hevea brasiliensis, the tree that had made fortunes during the rubber boom of the late 19th century, grew wild across the basin. The boom had collapsed decades earlier when British agents smuggled seeds to Asia and established plantations that undercut Brazilian production. But Ford believed the failure was one of method, not geography. The Brazilians, in his view, had relied on chaotic extraction from scattered wild trees. Ford would impose order. He would plant rubber in rows. He would apply the same principles that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing: standardization, efficiency, control. In 1927, Ford's representatives negotiated a concession with the Brazilian state of Pará. The terms were extraordinary. Ford received 5 million acres of land along the Tapajós River, an area larger than the state of Connecticut, for a token payment. In exchange, he promised to build infrastructure, employ Brazilian workers, and pay a modest export tax on rubber after 9 years. The Brazilian government, hungry for foreign investment and modernization, saw the deal as progress arriving by steamship. Ford saw it as inevitable. The master plan was drafted in Dearborn, Michigan, by men who had never seen a rainforest. They designed a company town based on templates from Ford's operations in the American Midwest. There would be workers' housing, neat bungalows painted in cheerful colors, arranged along gridded streets, a central plaza, a hospital equipped with modern American medical technology, schools to educate workers' children in English and Portuguese, a sawmill, a machine shop, a power plant, a water treatment facility, a railway. There would be recreational facilities, a golf course, a swimming pool, a cinema showing Hollywood films. There would be gardens planted with flowers and vegetables from North America, proof that the jungle could be tamed and made familiar. The workers would live according to Ford's principles. They would rise early, work 8-hour shifts, eat balanced meals in a company cafeteria. They would be paid fair wages, housed in sanitary conditions, offered health care and education. They would not drink alcohol or smoke tobacco. They would not gamble. They would attend community events designed to instill pride and discipline. Ford genuinely believed he was offering salvation: economic, moral, hygienic. He believed that modern industrial life, properly organized, would lift workers out of poverty and superstition. That the forest, properly managed, would yield rubber as reliably as a factory yielded automobiles. The projections were dizzying. Within a decade, Fordlândia was expected to produce enough latex to supply the entire Ford Motor Company. Thousands of workers would be employed. A city would rise from the jungle. Brazil would reclaim its position in the global rubber trade, this time under the guidance of American efficiency. The rubber barons of the old boom had grown rich through exploitation and chaos. Ford would prove that wealth could be built on fairness and system. There were warnings. Brazilian officials familiar with the region pointed out that the land Ford had chosen was unsuitable for large-scale agriculture. Agronomists noted that heavier trees, when planted in dense concentrations, were vulnerable to leaf blight, a fungal disease that had never been a threat in the wild, where trees grew scattered and isolated. Labor organizers warned that Amazonian workers would not accept the regimentation Ford demanded. But these warnings came from people Ford's team considered backward, entrenched in failure, resistant to progress. The warnings were noted and dismissed. In 1928, the first ships arrived at the site Ford had selected, a plateau above the Tapajós River. They carried lumber, machinery, cement, tools, and several dozen American managers. The forest was cleared with machetes and fire. The work was brutal. Malaria and yellow fever swept through the camps. Supplies rotted in the heat. The river flooded, destroying equipment. But construction continued. Ford's managers sent reports back to Michigan emphasizing progress. Photographs showed stumps where jungle had been, foundations where buildings would stand. The rubber trees were planted in 1929, row after row after row, stretching across the cleared plateau. From above, they formed a geometric pattern, a grid imposed on chaos. The symmetry was satisfying to men trained in industrial logic. It looked like the future. It looked like control. The land had not yet delivered its verdict. By 1930, Fordlândia had the appearance of progress. The main street was paved. Workers' bungalows stood in pastel rows, yellow, blue, green. their wooden frames imported from the United States, their designs suited to temperate climates. The hospital opened with 20 beds, X-ray equipment, and American nurses who spoke no Portuguese. The sawmill operated at capacity, processing timber cleared from the plantation. A diesel generator provided electricity to the American manager's compound. At night, light bulbs glowed in the jungle, visible for miles along the river. Visitors sent by the Brazilian government wrote admiringly of the transformation. Ford's publicity department distributed photographs of orderly streets and smiling workers. The narrative was one of triumph, modern civilization advancing into wilderness. But beneath the surface, failures were accumulating. The workers Ford's recruiters had hired, caboclos, river people, displaced indigenous laborers, did not adapt to industrial discipline the way Ford's planners had assumed. They were accustomed to a rhythm dictated by the forest and the river, not by the factory whistle. They fished, hunted, gathered. They worked when they needed money and rested when they did not. The concept of an 8-hour shift, 5 or 6 days a week, enforced by time cards and supervisors, felt like captivity. Many simply left. Others stayed but resisted in small, persistent ways. The food became a point of conflict. Ford's cafeteria served meals based on American nutritional science: oatmeal, canned vegetables, white bread, beef. The workers, accustomed to manioc, fish, tropical fruit, found the food bland and unfamiliar. They were not permitted to bring their own meals. They were not allowed to cook in their homes. Fire was considered a hazard in the wooden bungalows. Resentment grew. In December 1930, it erupted. Workers rioted, smashing the cafeteria, destroying time cards, chasing American managers into the forest. Brazilian military police were called in to restore order. Several workers were arrested. Ford's representatives blamed agitators and communists. They did not reconsider the system. The rubber trees presented a different kind of rebellion. The first saplings grew quickly in the cleared soil, their leaves broad and green. Ford's managers reported healthy growth, but within 2 years, the leaves began to show signs of disease. South American leaf blight, Microcyclus ule, a fungus native to the Amazon, spread through the densely planted rows with devastating efficiency. In the wild, rubber trees grew scattered, separated by dozens of other species. The distance acted as a firebreak. An infected tree might lose its leaves, but the fungus could not easily jump to the next rubber tree half a kilometer away. In Fordlândia's plantations, the trees stood meters apart, a continuous feast for the pathogen. Ford's agronomists tried everything. They sprayed fungicides. They pruned infected branches. They experimented with resistant rootstock. Nothing worked. The blight returned every rainy season, defoliating entire sections of the plantation. Latex production remained negligible. By 1933, Fordlândia had produced almost no commercial rubber. The trees that survived were stunted, scarred, unproductive. Ford had spent millions of dollars to create the ideal conditions for an agricultural catastrophe. The Americans did not blame the plan. They blamed the location. In 1934, Ford's company acquired a second site, 65 miles downstream, a place called Belterra. The soil there was better, they believed. The elevation was different. Surely the results would improve. Construction began again. More clearing, more planting, more bungalows, more attempts to replicate Michigan on the equator. Fordlândia was not abandoned, but its role shifted. It became a cautionary example, even as the project doubled down. The workers who remained in Fordlândia adapted in ways the planners had not anticipated. They cultivated gardens behind their bungalows, growing manioc and bananas in defiance of regulations. They fished the Tapajós at night. They built informal markets where goods banned by Ford, cachaca, tobacco, wild game, were traded quietly. A parallel economy emerged. invisible to the Americans, sustained by the very people the system was designed to reform. The town Ford built became a stage set. Real life happened elsewhere, in the margins the blueprints had not accounted for. The question remained, unspoken but unavoidable. What happens when the future refuses to cooperate? Belterra was supposed to be the corrected version, the lesson learned. The site was chosen with more care. The soil tested better. The elevation was lower, closer to river level, with different drainage patterns. Ford's agronomists believed these variables would matter. They planted rubber trees again, this time with improved spacing, better rootstock, more sophisticated techniques. For a few years, optimism returned. Belterra grew faster than Fordlândia had. By 1937, it had its own grid of streets, its own rows of pastel bungalows, its own American managers living in relative comfort, while Brazilian workers lived under the same restrictions that had sparked riots upstream. The town even had amenities Fordlândia lacked: a larger hospital, a better water system, a more elaborate recreational center, complete with a dance hall and a library, stocked with books in English that almost no one could read. The golf course was maintained with obsessive care, its greens a vivid, unnatural color against the surrounding forest. Photographs from the late 1930s show Belterra as Ford's publicists wanted it seen: modern, orderly, hopeful. What the photographs do not show is that the rubber trees were failing again. The blight was slower to arrive at Belterra, but it arrived. The fungus did not care about soil quality or elevation. It cared about density, about the concentration of host trees. By 1940, sections of Belterra's plantation showed the same curling spotted leaves that had doomed Fordlândia. Yields remained far below projections. The cost per pound of latex produced in the Amazon was several times higher than the cost of purchasing it from Asian plantations, even with British tariffs factored in. The economics had never made sense. Ford's accountants knew this, but the project had become something other than a business decision. It had become a test of will, a refusal to admit that some problems could not be solved by American determination and capital. Daily life in both towns settled into a strange rhythm. The workers who stayed, and turnover remained high, learned to navigate the system. They showed up for roll call. They worked their shifts in the plantation, or the sawmill, or the maintenance crews. They accepted their wages in scrip, redeemable only at the company store, where prices were set by Ford's managers. They attended the mandatory health inspections, the English classes, the recreational activities designed to build morale and instill discipline. And then, in the hours Ford's system did not account for, they lived differently. Behind the bungalows, invisible to the American supervisors, a parallel world existed. Workers grew food in hidden gardens. They hunted in the forest at dawn, before the work whistle. They fermented cachaca in secret, traded it for goods, drank it in defiance of Ford's temperance rules. They held festivals the company did not authorize, drumming and dancing late into the night. When managers complained about the noise, workers apologized and continued. The rebellion was not dramatic. It was persistent, patient, rooted in the understanding that Ford's rules applied only to the visible surface of life. The American managers lived in a different reality. Their compound was separated from the workers' housing by careful design. They had larger homes, better food, access to amenities denied to Brazilian employees. They socialized among themselves, played golf, watched films shipped from the United States. Many spoke little or no Portuguese. They relied on translators and foremen to communicate with the workforce. They saw the towns through reports and statistics, not through the experience of walking the streets, entering the workers' homes, understanding what the system felt like from below. When production targets were missed, they blamed laziness, inefficiency, sabotage. They did not question whether the targets had ever been realistic. By the early 1940s, the strategic justification for Fordlândia and Belterra had evaporated. Synthetic rubber, developed during World War II, was becoming cheaper and more reliable than natural latex. The Ford Motor Company no longer needed to control its own rubber supply. The plantations in the Amazon, after 15 years of effort and an investment approaching $30 million, had produced negligible amounts of usable rubber. The towns remained, but their purpose had vanished. Still, Ford did not close the operation. The towns continued. Workers were still employed, still housed, still subjected to the same moral codes and industrial discipline. The project had outlived its logic, sustained now only by institutional inertia and the unwillingness to admit failure. Visitors in the 1940s described Fordlândia and Belterra as ghost towns inhabited by the living, places where the future had been built and then forgotten, where the machinery of progress ran on, purposeless, waiting for someone to turn it off. The land, patient and indifferent, continued its work of reclamation. Henry Ford died in 1947. He never visited Fordlândia or Belterra. He never walked the streets his planners had laid out, never saw the rubber trees struggling under the weight of his assumptions, never spoke to the workers who had learned to survive his vision. In his final years, when asked about the Amazon project, he reportedly said little. The subject had become an embarrassment, though never publicly acknowledged as a failure. His company, now run by his grandson, Henry Ford II, had no interest in continuing the experiment. In 1945, Ford Motor Company sold both Fordlândia and Belterra back to the Brazilian government for a fraction of what had been invested. The price was $244, roughly the cost of a single year's maintenance. The Brazilian government accepted the properties without enthusiasm. They inherited 2 jungle towns built to American specifications, thousands of acres of diseased rubber trees, infrastructure designed for a population that had never materialized, and a workforce that had endured 2 decades of cultural imposition in exchange for wages that barely sustained them. The transition was quiet. Most of the American managers left within months. The few who remained were absorbed into Brazilian administration or departed when their contracts expired. The workers, many of whom had spent years in Fordlândia or Belterra, faced a choice: stay in towns that no longer had a clear purpose, or return to the river communities they had left. Some stayed. They had built lives there, had children born in the pastel bungalows, had adapted to the strange hybrid existence the towns represented. Others left immediately, abandoning homes they had never truly owned. The Brazilian government attempted to maintain rubber production for a few years. They hired new managers, adjusted labor policies, experimented with different cultivation methods. But the fundamental problems remained. The blight could not be controlled. The soil could not sustain intensive agriculture. The logistics of exporting rubber from the remote Amazon interior made the operation economically unviable. By the early 1950s, commercial rubber production had effectively ceased. The plantations were left to grow wild or were converted to subsistence farming by the remaining residents. What happened next was slow erasure. The power plant ran intermittently, then stopped. The hospital lost its American equipment to rust and theft, became a clinic staffed by a single Brazilian doctor, then closed entirely. The sawmill operated sporadically until the machinery broke beyond repair. The golf course, untended, returned to scrub and forest. The cinema screened its last film sometime in the 1950s. No one recorded exactly when. The swimming pool cracked, filled with rainwater, became a breeding ground for mosquitoes. The water tower, stamped with Ford's name, remained standing, visible for miles, a monument to certainty that had dissolved. The town did not empty completely. A few hundred people remained in Fordlândia, a few hundred more in Belterra. They were not the population Ford had imagined, disciplined industrial workers producing for a global market. They were subsistence farmers, fishermen, small-scale traders, people making use of the infrastructure that remained functional. They repurposed the bungalows, tearing out walls to create larger spaces, adding outdoor kitchens, planting gardens in the gridded streets. They ignored the regulations that no longer had enforcers. They built the lives Ford's system had tried to prevent. The rubber trees, released from human expectation, followed their own trajectory. Some died, claimed by blight or soil exhaustion. Others survived, growing tall and wild, no longer planted in rows, but scattered by birds and wind. The forest began its patient return, not erasing the town, but incorporating it, vines climbing the walls of the hospital, roots breaking through the paved streets, saplings emerging from cracks in the foundations. The jungle did not conquer Fordlândia. It simply resumed, indifferent to the interlude of American ambition. By the 1960s, Fordlândia had become a curiosity, a place mentioned occasionally in histories of the rubber trade or studies of failed utopias. Journalists visited, took photographs of the rusting machinery and the overgrown streets, interviewed elderly residents who remembered the American managers and the riots and the years of believing the town might actually become what it was designed to be. The residents spoke without bitterness mostly. They had survived. That was its own achievement. The question Ford never answered still lingered in the empty manager's mansion, in the silent power plant, in the trees that refused to produce. Can an industrial dream survive when it ignores the land and the people living on it? Today, Fordlândia remains inhabited. Around 2,000 people live there, a number that has remained roughly stable for decades. Most work in small-scale agriculture, fishing or logging. The town has electricity, supplied by the Brazilian government. It has a school, a health clinic, a church. The streets Ford's engineers paved are cracked and overgrown, but they still follow the grid. The bungalows still stand, modified beyond recognition, painted in colors their original architects never intended. The water tower is still there, Ford's name still visible, faded but legible. It serves no function. The water system collapsed years ago. Residents draw from wells or the river. Belterra fared slightly better. It became the administrative center of a small municipality. Its population is larger, around 7,000. The rubber plantation was converted to other crops, soybeans, palm oil, managed forest. The town has paved roads, internet access, a modest economy tied to regional agriculture. It does not resemble the industrial utopia Ford envisioned, but it functions. The residents do not think much about Henry Ford. His name is on a street sign, on the water tower. That is all. The lesson Fordlândia offers is not subtle, but it has been ignored with remarkable consistency. In the decades since Ford's failure, dozens of similar projects have been launched in the Amazon and beyond. Planned cities built on the assumption that nature and culture can be redesigned to serve industrial or ideological visions. Brasilia imposed a modernist grid on the Cerrado. Yari, another American venture, attempted industrial forestry and failed for many of the same reasons Fordlândia did. The pattern repeats because the conviction behind it, that systems designed in distant offices can override local reality, remains seductive. The Amazon taught Ford nothing because he never listened. He saw the jungle as an obstacle to be cleared, the workers as raw material to be disciplined, the rubber trees as machines that would perform if properly calibrated. He could not imagine that the land had its own logic, that the people had their own knowledge, that some problems cannot be solved by capital and willpower. The forest did not defeat Ford. It simply waited. What remains is a question without resolution. Can an industrial dream survive when it ignores the land and the people living on it? Fordlândia answers clearly, no, but the dream persists elsewhere, in other forms, under other names, driven by the same unshakable belief that the future can be imposed, that progress is a formula, that the world will yield if only the design is bold enough. The water tower still stands above the canopy. The vines climb higher every year. If this story stirred something, the hubris, the resilience, the jungle's quiet victory, please like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments which planned city or failed utopia you'd like us to investigate next. Thank you for watching. Some dreams end. The forest continues.